Hi everyone, it's Dave here today. I'm coming at you with a video on a technique, something that I came up with recently when I was trying to create a new different kind of watercolor look, sort of a faux watercolor look, and I stumbled across this idea of die cutting with napkins. So I'm going to show you today how to create some really interesting texture using napkins and your die cuts. Now to illustrate the process, I'm going to be using the Silverdale branch die. This is a die I recently designed for the 2019 holiday collection, and just some basic paper napkins. These are just ordinary napkins. You can get them at any kind of supermarket. And I wanted to show you everything's all folded up there. The more layers that you fold up, the more layers are going to be die cut, and you can see how you want to fold them. I just folded them in half, and then I stuck a piece of cardstock in back of it just to create a little bit of extra structure and stiffness. Now you're going to die cut it the same way that you normally would die cut. And I tried a bunch of different kinds of dies. I didn't really find that one worked better than others. You can use pretty much any die cut for this technique. So what we're doing is we're running it through the die cut machine. The cardstock layers on the bottom and then folded napkin on top. And when you remove it from the die cut machine, all of those layers of napkin will become super compressed onto the cardstock. In fact, you probably won't see any difference between the laminated napkins on a die cut piece and regular cardstock. They look pretty much the same. But you'll notice as soon as you start adding some paint to these napkin die cuts, it does behave differently. You can see right there when you add moisture, lots of water, it crinkles up and creates a little bit of puffy texture. It's so interesting to look at it. It really catches the light. It's almost like faux watercolor paper. So this is an inexpensive way to use something that most of us have to create a whole new look with your die cut. I'm using watercolor paint. I'm just using a very small paintbrush. This is a round brush, probably a size 0, and I'm just dipping into different colors of green paint, and sometimes I'll just dip into a little bit of water, and then when I put it onto the napkin die cut, you can see that that really absorbs that moisture. Just so thirsty, it just soaks it right up, and the napkin tends to puff a little bit and create some wrinkles on the surface of the die cut. Now I'm putting all of that color around the die cut. You'll notice that it spreads quite a bit. Don't worry about this. This is all just kind of a collage-y sort of technique. If you're really careful, you could probably put the color exactly where you want to, but know that this paint moves a little bit. It travels just like you would expect it to on regular watercolor paper. So know that it's going to be sort of a fluid, sort of organic look. Now, I discovered this technique when I was trying to do something different. I had this idea that if I could cut something absorbent like sponge or napkins with my die cut, and then I pressed it into a distressed oxide background, it would pull that image off the distressed oxide background. And I wasn't very successful with that. You guys might try that yourselves and see if you can get a little bit more successful. But after I die cut a few of these napkins, I realized that when they get wet, the color looks really interesting on them, and the shape of the napkin sort of crinkles up and adds all this beautiful texture to the cardstock. And it's not like anything I've been able to create with a die cut before, so I knew I'd stumbled across something. I'm putting just a little bit of watercolor onto each little area. You see that here I've loaded up my brush with some red and then I spread it on there. It's going to sort of travel around over the napkin and it'll mix with that green that also got on the berry, and we'll just say that it adds to the artistic element of that whole collage die cut napkin look. So I pretty much spread everything where I want it to be. You'll see there's a few white spaces here and there. That's okay. The paint tends to travel still a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and accent it with some gold metallic paint. And I want you to see, again, I'm using a small brush. I'm just loading it up with a little bit of gold. And I'm just spreading it sort of haphazardly on the leaf just to give it a little gilded look. it'll sort of catch the tops and the bumps of those napkin ridges and add sparkly gold here and there. And you end up getting a really beautiful look just with these little napkin die cut pieces. I'll use my brush just to kind of move things around a little bit. Just depends on you how much water you want to add to this. And then once you're done, you'll let it dry for, I would say at least 10 to 15 minutes. And then it's good and ready to go on to your project. I think this looks really good with leaves, especially because it gives that crinkly, textured sort of look that just sort of lends itself to sort of a dried leaf or dried floral sort of look. So look through your collection of dies. I'm going to go ahead and use another die from our recent holiday collection. This is the Harvest Branch corner frame die. Again, I've used a piece of cardstock and then I folded a napkin on top of it and run it through the die cut machine. So this has about 8 layers of napkin on top. I encourage you guys to try different mediums. I'm certain that tissue paper would probably give you a similar result. Again, anything that's very thin that will probably respond to water by puffing up and absorbing and moving that paint around, I think will work. The medium that you use to paint it is up to you. You could use some ink pad ink like Distress Oxides, Distress Ink. I used watercolor for all of mine, but I think that you could probably use any water-based medium to do this basic technique. And I'm just following those same guidelines again. I'm starting with the leaves, and I decided to start with the darkest color first and let it sort of move around on the leaf a bit before I added a little bit lighter color of green and then encouraged that to move around. Now the more water you put on there, the puffier it gets and the more wrinkly it gets and the more the paint moves around. So you can sort of measure out how much you want to put onto the die cut as you get more experienced with working with this medium. I've taken my bigger brush, this is a number 4 round brush, and just loaded it up with some brown sort of caramely colored paint. And I'm just going and putting it all along the frame. You can see all I have to do is barely touch this, and that tissue, or the napkin rather, really absorbs that paint and it just flows right into it, puffs it up, and all those little cuts in the die really get accentuated because those cuts stay down and all that napkin sort of raises up around it. So that's where it's not quite like working with watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is terrific for moving fluid watercolor around. You add it and it'll move really well all over the paper. The napkin die cutting is different because it absorbs in and instantly puffs up. So it doesn't travel quite as far as watercolor paper, but you can experiment with how much liquid you add onto your brush, and then when you touch the napkin, it'll move depending on how much fluid there is. Now notice that some of that red and some of that green has gotten onto those stems, and that's no problem. I'm going to go with my darkest color last, so I've loaded up my brush with some brown watercolor paint. I'm going to paint right over that, and if it blends a little bit so that the brown looks a little green or red, that's okay. It's just part of the look of this particular process. I just want to encourage you to play around with this. The texture that you get is so beautiful. I hope you can see in the video how fluffy and textured this die cut gets once you add some moisture to it. I've decided to gild this too. Again, I've just spread some metallic golden paint on here. Any kind of metallic watercolor paint will work. Basically, you're just sort of whisking it over the top and it settles down into the grooves and makes things sort of puff up a little bit more. I'm going to do a close-up here. I've added little dots of metallic watercolor, and then I go back in with a slightly damp brush and just sort of rub it around so it just gets sort of a frosted look on these berries. The trick here is to put that gold paint down first and then quickly come back in with a slightly damp brush and rub it around, and you get this nice, soft, sort of faded golden look on there that's just so romantic and beautiful. So now that I've shown you a couple of die cuts that have some pretty big solid area, I also wanted to share with you a die cut that had some very thin die cut shapes to it, just to show you that this texture and puffiness still works on really fine line detailed dies. I'm going to do the same process again. This is the pine needle oval frame, and you can see that the napkin is absorbing the paint just like it would on the other die cuts. And the fine detail is still holding together. It doesn't puff up so much that you lose all those little pine needle twigs. I've put down a teal sort of blue spruce sort of color paint on there. And then I'm going to load up a larger brush and get some silvery paint and just sort of dab that on as well. It's going to mix a little bit with that blue paint, and that's okay. It just kind of gives a nice blended look and gets a little shimmery. And then I couldn't resist putting a little bit more gold on there. I thought the gold and silver and blue could make a really nice collage sort of look. I decided to end it there rather than paint the border, so I just let it dry, and you can see up close here, it gets all that nice texture even on those fine lines. And I've incorporated it into the design of the die here, adding a sentiment, and you can see how it puffs up over the background and really creates some beautiful sculptural texture on a card. You don't get quite the same wrinkly texture as you do on solid shapes, so I decided to switch back to something that had a little bit more flat area to it. I grabbed the Poinsettia die from Poppystamps, and I die cut out, just like we've been doing, layers of napkin on top of a piece of cardstock. And I've decided that I really love those big flat areas because they puff up and get really wrinkly. And my happy surprise here was it looked just like the leaf that you would see on a poinsettia. So adding that water makes it kind of wrinkly and puffy. And if you look at poinsettias, that's exactly the texture that they have. So this technique especially is suited for something like a poinsettia or maybe a floral sort of die, but this one turned out great. I added lots of water just because it's kind of a big die cut shape. I put pink down first and then a darker red in the middle. And then I went back, added a little bit of gold, and then with a slightly damp brush, I just rubbed that gold around just so it settled down into the little nooks and crannies of those leaves and gave it this beautiful frosted look. Now you'll notice a couple times when I'm brushing over these watercolor die cuts, the napkin slips just a little, but it still ended up being okay. I let it dry, everything sort of stuck in place. If things start to come apart, sometimes the napkin might pull apart at the end, just add a little bit of glue at the end just to put it back on there, but they stay pretty much compressed together with no problem at all. Okay, I have a couple more I'd like to share with you. This is the corner holly swirl. I don't think that you need to go and see all my painting again, so I'm just going to show you the final result. It's the same process, die cutting with the napkins and then adding different shades of watercolor and gold over the top. It makes a beautiful accent and it looks more carved than anything, especially with a die cut that has all these lines cut into it. And of course, after I saw how well the leaf turned out on the poinsettia and the corner holly, I got out some actual leaf dies and went to town with them. I did the same process, but this time added a whole bunch of different colors of watercolor on there to really make some interesting fall leaves. I gilded it with gold at the end, splattered the background, and you have a beautiful autumn card that's really artistic and fun to do. I hope you learned a few things today. Until next time, take care.